Hi you guys, happy Thursday. Your FRQ for chapter 5 is tomorrow. As you've had a little practice now with the past two, again this will be timed. You will have 2 questions to answer. And yeah, you should kind of know the deal by now. I will be available tomorrow morning. If you have questions, today we're going to be talking about emerging adulthood. So we talked prenatal environment, kind of development through childhood, adolescence, and now we are at adulthood. And you are actually going to be doing an activity today. It's a discussion post that asks you to chat with a couple of different people and collect advice for outgoing seniors. And so just kind of keep that in mind. It might take you a couple of minutes just to figure out who you might be phone calling or talking to in your household or whatever. So just know that that's today, and it's to get some insight into how different aged people approach their outlook of life. So we will chat about that, and then I will give you more instruction at the end for the activity. Enjoy!
So as I said, you have an activity to do, a discussion post at the end of this, so we're going to try and introduce this pretty quick, and then there's a short 12-minute TED Talk at the end that kind of wraps everything back together. So with that, let's get started chatting about aging and adulthood. So let's first talk about this idea of what is quote-unquote emerging adulthood. The reason that this term has been introduced is because as time has gone on, we've seen added years of education, later marriage, and this has delayed full adult independence beyond that idea of traditional adolescence, right? In 1890, women got their periods around age 15, 16, and they were married by age 21. Now we're seeing women get their first period or their menarche at age 12, 13 on average, and they're not getting married until age on average, again, 25. And this is, our textbook's a little older, so I would venture to guess, I don't have the specific data, but I would venture to guess that number is actually even higher now in 2020 than it was in, say, 2005, probably when this data was collected. So we have come to this conclusion that there's this idea of emerging adulthood, right? This seems to have created a new phase, which can be called emerging adulthood, and that's ages 18 to 25. That's when people are no longer adolescents, but they're not married, they're not living their own independent life quite yet. So for many of you seniors, that's coming up here, right? You're going to go off to college, you're going to live your life away from your parents, but you're still going to have some of that dependence. You're not going to be entirely independent and on your own with no kind of support line. So to revisit one of those debates that we talked about at the very beginning of this chapter in terms of developmental psychology as a whole, right? Is development occurring for people in stages, or is it a more continuous kind of morphic change over time, right? Researchers who see development as a function of experience tend to see development as continuous and gradual, right? Nature or nurture is continuous, right? That experience, you're constantly changing your behavior and your response to certain stimulus based on experiences that you've had in your past and things that you've learned, right? That nature component. On the flip side, then, researchers who focus on biological maturation see spurts of growth and other changes that make out stage of development very different from one another, right? That's nature has stages. So we know when we're talking about these kind of stages, this image below here gives you some insight into how Kohlberg, Erikson, and Piaget, how all of their theories of development kind of overlap with one another. So I think this is a really good one. Today we're going to be talking, if we're looking at Erik Erikson and we think about the Pixar video that we watched yesterday, right, and Up, we're looking at the generativity and integrity kind of components of Erikson's development, right? Think about Andy giving his toys away, and I can't remember the guy's name in Up, but the little old man in Up is that integrity piece. So that's where we're going today as we move ahead. So when we're talking about adulthood, this can as has been the case for all of our conversations pertaining to developmental psych, it can be physical, cognitive, and social development, right? Within physical, we see kind of the physical peak is in mid to late 20s, and from there on out, our physicality declines, and that number is very different from one individual to another, right? We know there's like a lot of professional athletes who are still in prime physical condition in their 40s. Think like Tom Brady, right? And so like this can be different from person to person, but we know that physical development kind of starts to decline as people start to age. We see the lifespan expanding, and death is on the horizon. We will talk a little bit about death today, so if that's kind of a trigger for you, if you're coping with something, or if you have something going on, just note we are going to be talking about death just briefly, as it does pertain to kind of our understanding of people's mentality shift over time when that becomes more of a reality. So just kind of recognize we're heading that way. Cognitive development, right? Memory starts to decline. In terms of social development, it's not just like what friends do you have, but it's making like long-term commitments to a spouse or a partner, bearing children, and like having that unconditional love. So we see kind of these shifts taking place over time. Like I mentioned, there are physical changes, and one of those is the end of reproductive years. Between ages of 40 and 60, physical vitality, such as endurance and strength, may still be more of a function of lifestyle rather than biological decline, right? We're talking like the Tom Brady's, the professional athletes, the people who train for marathons, right? You can stay healthy and fit throughout your lifespan, but as time goes on, and once you hit 60 years old, 70 years old, right, there are physical components to your muscles in your bodies that do just naturally biologically tend to decline. We also see the end of reproductive years. There's a gradual decline in sexual activity in adulthood, although sexuality continues throughout a lifetime. Around age 50, women enter menopause, and this is the end of their ability to become pregnant. Note that men never really stop producing sperm, and so they can, for almost the entirety of their life, impregnate a woman, but women can't get pregnant past the time when they start their menopause. If you think about that from an evolutionary psychology perspective, right, that makes sense. Women, it's a risk to get pregnant, right? So they stopped being able to conceive as their bodies were no longer able to handle the stress of childbirth, whereas men, it doesn't impact them, but they still want to reproduce and pass on their genes, right? So evolutionarily speaking, right, this makes sense. Then we see, again, the aging body. These are some more physical changes. Potential lifespan for the human body is estimated to be about 122 years. Obviously, currently human beings aren't achieving that potential because of a variety of stressors, the environment, all sorts of things, right? But there is the potential lifespan for 122 years. Life expectancy refers to the average expected lifespan, and if you look over here on this chart, if you're interested, we know that the average has increased over time because of better medical practice, because of better technology, because of better access to food and water, but you can see that life expectancy does still range depending on the country that you're raised in. We also know that more women live to be of an older age than men. And yeah, we can reference life expectancy kind of as a piece of the puzzle when we're talking about the aging body. But don't be too concerned. It's not like you hit 25 and everything's downhill from there, right? Exercise can slow the aging process, right? You can build muscle and bone, stimulate neurogenesis, which is neurogenesis, which continues to produce new neural connections, right? Telomeres are the tips of your chromosomes. Under extreme stress, those telomeres actually start to break down, and it limits the ability for your chromosomes, your DNA, to reproduce and continue to make new cells. And so we see people who endure long periods of stress to actually age quicker, right? Think about like presidents, their before and after shots, and like the wrinkles and the gray hair, right? That's because those telomeres are being broken down. Exercise can help that. Exercise can improve cognition and reduce the risk of dementia. This is an awesome picture. I wish this was like somebody I knew and I could go hang out with him, but whatever. So these next few slides are kind of a lot of writing. You are not going to need to know the specific like biological changes that goes on in the brain throughout the aging process, right? You're not going to have to know about what happens to the myelin sheath. You're not going to have to know about like frontal lobe atrophy. A lot of these things, now that you know the biology of the brain, are pretty intuitive. We understand that certain areas of the brain that are associated with memory are going to shrink with age, making it harder to form new memories, right? That makes sense. Things like the amygdala, hippocampus, and whatnot. By age 80, a healthy brain is 5% lighter than a brain in middle adulthood. That's because all of these parts of the brain are shrinking. We're not making as many new neural connections, and so that weight and the mass of the brain continuously declines throughout adulthood. And with that comes one of the most commonly discussed, I don't know if that's the right term, but commonly well-known issues with the aging process, and that is Alzheimer's and other dementia. Just to be clear, it is Alzheimer's. When I was in college, one of my roommates genuinely thought that this disease was called old-timers. It is not. It is Alzheimer's. Keep that little bit of knowledge as you move forward in life. But we know that patients who have Alzheimer's, you can see in the image down here in the bottom right, their brain is significantly smaller. And those middle parts of the brain that used to house like the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, they are nearly depleted, right? So it's very difficult for people who have Alzheimer's to make new memories and to recall anything. Like think about The Notebook. If you've seen The Notebook, what's her name? Allie. When Allie is in the home and she can't remember Noah, right? That is an example of Alzheimer's. This is because of a loss of brain cells and neural network connections. There's a deterioration of neurons that produce acetylcholine, which is the memory neurotransmitter, right? You learned about acetylcholine when we talk neurotransmitters, and if the brain isn't producing those, it's really difficult to remember things. We see shriveled and broken protein filaments forming plaques at the tips of neurons, so they can't transmit their signal as effectively, and again, that dramatic shrinking of the brain, as you see in this image. Dementia is almost like a lesser version of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is pretty severe, and there is a lot of medical research going towards figuring out a cure for it. There's a lot of famous actors and actresses who have parents who are speaking out about Alzheimer's and the impact that it can have on not only those who have it, but their families. So just kind of one thing to think about in terms of this aging process and how the biologically speaking, we see this have a severe impact on our development and our brain. So I'm going to just kind of step aside a little bit and just insert a couple of definitions here because you will have to know the difference between a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study, right? Think all the way back to chapter 1 when we talked about the different methodological practices of how psychologists do research, right? A couple of those options into how to study these changes over time is to do a cross-sectional study, which compares people at different ages all at one time. So if I want to know how different people respond to a certain stimulus or solve a certain brain puzzle, right, I would take an 8-year-old, a group of 8-year-olds, a group of 14-year-olds, a group of 20-year-olds, a group of 30-year-olds, and a group of 45-year-olds, right? And I would have them all do it, and I would compare, right? That's a cross-sectional study, right? The issue with cross-sectional studies is that somebody who maybe is 80 today didn't have the same educational opportunities that somebody who is 45 today had. And so we might institute what we call a longitudinal study to overcome that potential difference of experience, because obviously a 45-year-old, not because of their brain, not because of their development, might have a better job or have a better an easier time like solving a problem because they went to a 4-year college because that was normative for them, whereas an 80-year-old maybe didn't, and that's why it's difficult for them to do that problem, not because their brain is deteriorating, right? So issues with cross-sectional studies. So they might want to overcome those by a longitudinal study, which basically takes a same group of people and tests them over time. So they'll choose a group of 7-year-olds. The biggest one was done in Ireland. They took like 10,000 7-year-olds that were in primary school and tested them like periodically throughout their life. And they're still actually testing. They have still like thousands of candidates that are alive, and they're kind of gauging the changes over time. So just recognize cross-sectional studies versus longitudinal studies. And the last slide here just talks about well-being across the lifespan, right? I know as I was growing up, my mom would always tell me like, oh, the 40s, they're the best years of your life. And then she was like, oh, the 50s, they're your best years of your life. And now she's 63 and 64. She's like, oh, the 60s, they're the best years of my life, right? And so we know that like happiness is a pretty constant trait across time. People who feel happy when they're 20 generally feel pretty happy when they're 40 and when they're 80, right? And you can kind of see that here. And the question that this draws up is like, why are people happy even when their health is in decline? Like where do we see this shift from like I need to be like good at sports and like being able to do X, Y, and Z to like I'm just content being with my family, right? And having a home and tending to my garden, right? That makes me happy, like whatever. So just recognize that. We're going to watch a talk here about what makes life good. This is one of like the most watched TED Talks. And this man took lessons from the longest study on happiness. I can't remember if it was a longitudinal study. I'm going to watch it here in just a second, but longitudinal or cross-sectional study. But take note of that. After this, you are going to hop on Canvas and do that activity where you're reaching out to people. So hopefully that's fun in this time of kind of uncertainty where we don't get to connect with people as much. This gives you an opportunity to kind of do that. So enjoy. This is the last lecture of the day. Tomorrow, or of the chapter. Tomorrow you have your FRQ. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Enjoy.
What keeps us healthy and happy as we go through life? If you were going to invest now in your future best self, where would you put your time and your energy? There was a recent survey of millennials asking them what their most important life goals were. And over 80% said that a major life goal for them was to get rich. And another 50% of those same young adults said that another major life goal was to become famous. And we're constantly told to lean into work, to push harder and achieve more. We're given the impression that these are the things that we need to go after in order to have a good life. Pictures of entire lives, of the choices that people make and how those choices work out for them, those pictures are almost impossible to get. Most of what we know about human life, we know from asking people to remember the past. And as we know, hindsight is anything but 20/20. We forget vast amounts of what happens to us in life, and sometimes memory is downright creative. But what if we could watch entire lives as they unfold through time? What if we could study people from the time that they were teenagers all the way into old age to see what really keeps people happy and healthy? We did that. The Harvard study of adult development may be the longest study of adult life that's ever been done. For 75 years, we've tracked the lives of 724 men. year after year, asking about their work, their home lives, their health, and of course, asking all along the way without knowing how their life stories were going to turn out. Studies like this are exceedingly rare. Almost all projects of this kind fall apart within a decade because too many people drop out of the study, or funding for the research dries up, or the researchers get distracted, or they die, and nobody moves the ball further down the field. But through a combination of luck and the persistence of several generations of researchers, this study has survived. About 60 of our original 724 men are still alive, still participating in the study, most of them in their 90s. And we are now beginning to study the more than 2,000 children of these men. And I'm the fourth director of the study. Since 1938, we've tracked the lives of two groups of men. The first group started in the study when they were sophomores at Harvard College. They all finished college during World War II, and then most went off to serve in the war. And the second group that we've followed was a group of boys from Boston's poorest neighborhoods. Boys who were chosen for the study specifically because they were from some of the most troubled and disadvantaged families in the Boston of the 1930s. Most lived in tenements, many without hot and cold running water. When they entered the study, all of these teenagers were interviewed, they were given medical exams. We went to their homes and we interviewed their parents. And then these teenagers grew up into adults who entered all walks of life. They became factory workers and lawyers and bricklayers and doctors, one president of the United States. Some developed alcoholism, a few developed schizophrenia. Some climbed the social ladder from the bottom all the way to the very top, and some made that journey in the opposite direction. The founders of this study would never in their wildest dreams have imagined that I would be standing here today, 75 years later, telling you that the study still continues. Every 2 years, our patient and dedicated research staff calls up our men and asks them if we can send them yet one more set of questions about their lives. Many of the inner city Boston men ask us, "Why do you keep wanting to study me? My life just isn't that interesting." The Harvard men never asked that question. To get the clearest picture of these lives, we don't just send them questionnaires. We interview them in their living rooms. We get their medical records from their doctors. We draw their blood. We scan their brains. We talk to their children. We videotape them talking with their wives about their deepest concerns. And when about a decade ago we finally asked the wives if they would join us as members of the study, many of the women said, "It's about time." So what have we learned? What are the lessons that come from the tens of thousands of pages of information that we've generated on these lives? Well, the lessons aren't about wealth or fame or working harder and harder. The clearest message that we get from this 75-year study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. Period. We've learned 3 big lessons about relationships. The first is that social connections are really good for us and that loneliness kills. It turns out that people who are more socially connected to family, to friends, to community are happier, they're physically healthier, and they live longer than people who are less well connected. And the experience of loneliness turns out to be toxic. People who are more isolated than they want to be from others find that they are less happy, their health declines earlier in midlife, their brain functioning declines sooner, and they live shorter lives than people who are not lonely. And the sad fact is that at any given time, more than 1 in 5 Americans will report that they're lonely. And we know that you can be lonely in a crowd and you can be lonely in a marriage. So the second big lesson that we learned is that it's not just the number of friends you have, and it's not whether or not you're in a committed relationship, but it's the quality of your close relationships that matters. It turns out that living in the midst of conflict is really bad for our health. High conflict marriages, for example, without much affection, turn out to be very bad for our health, perhaps worse than getting divorced. And living in the midst of good, warm relationships is protective. Once we had followed our men all the way into their 80s, we wanted to look back at them at midlife and to see if we could predict who was going to grow into a happy, healthy octogenarian and who wasn't. And when we gathered together everything we knew about them at age 50, it wasn't their middle-aged cholesterol levels that predicted how they were going to grow old. It was how satisfied they were in their relationships. The people who were the most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were the healthiest at age 80. And good, close relationships seem to buffer us from some of the slings and arrows of getting old. Our most happily partnered men and women reported in their 80s that on the days when they had more physical pain, their moods stayed just as happy. But the people who were in unhappy relationships, on the days when they reported more physical pain, it was magnified by more emotional pain. And the third big lesson that we learn about relationships and our health is that good relationships don't just protect our bodies, they protect our brains. It turns out that being in a securely attached relationship to another person in your 80s is protective. That the people who are in relationships where they really feel they can count on the other person in times of need, those people's memories stay sharper longer. And the people in relationships where they feel they really can't count on the other one, those are the people who experience earlier memory decline. And those good relationships, they don't have to be smooth all the time. Some of our octogenarian couples could bicker with each other day in and day out. But as long as they felt that they could really count on the other when the going got tough, those arguments didn't take a toll on their memories. So, this message that good, close relationships are good for our health and well-being, this is wisdom that's as old as the hills. Why is this so hard to get and so easy to ignore? Well, we're human. What we'd really like is a quick fix, something we can get that'll make our lives good and keep them that way. Relationships are messy and they're complicated, and the hard work of tending to family and friends, that's not sexy or glamorous. It's also lifelong. It never ends. The people in our 75-year study who were the happiest in retirement were the people who had actively worked to replace workmates with new playmates. Just like the millennials in that recent survey, many of our men, when they were starting out as young adults, really believed that fame and wealth and high achievement were what they needed to go after to have a good life. But over and over these 75 years, our study has shown that the people who fared the best were the people who leaned into relationships with family, with friends, with community. So what about you? Let's say you're 25, or you're 40, or you're 60. What might leaning into relationships even look like? Well, the possibilities are practically endless. It might be something as simple as replacing screen time with people time, or livening up a stale relationship by doing something new together, long walks or date nights, or reaching out to that family member who you haven't spoken to in years, because those all too common family feuds take a terrible toll on the people who hold the grudges. I'd like to close with a quote from Mark Twain. More than a century ago, He was looking back on his life, and he wrote this: "There isn't time. So brief is life for bickerings, apologies, heartburnings, callings to account. There is only time for loving, and but an instant, so to speak, for that. The good life is built with good relationships." Thank you.
So like I said, you guys are going to be doing a discussion post. It's called the Dear Senior discussion post. And what you're basically going to be doing is reaching out to 3 different people that are at least 10 years in age difference. So that could be a parent, it could be a sibling, it could be a grandparent, it could be an aunt or uncle, a cousin, whomever. I really like this activity, especially for right now when we're all in isolation, we're all unable to be with all of the people that we would want to be with. I think this is a really practical and relevant way to start, or excuse to connect with some of those people. So maybe give your grandparent a call. Maybe call an aunt or an uncle and use this as an excuse just to say hi, check in, because we haven't had the opportunity to do so in a while. Maybe set up a Zoom meeting, whatever you want to do, FaceTime. But I do want you to think about, right, how this is not only like a really good engagement of like talking to people, but it's also really relevant to our understanding of this progression throughout life, right? We're asking for advice that somebody might give to a graduating senior, right? That advice coming from somebody who is 85 is probably going to be different than somebody who is 22, right? Like, and we know that that is the case. We know that that advice is going to be different, but why is that? What, psychologically speaking, in our understanding of development and development of the person, what does that fit into? How does this fit into our greater understanding? So I hope that this activity can be exciting for you. You could, like I said, talk to a friend, a parent, and a grandparent. They're all 10 years apart, and you're getting different perspective on different ages. You could talk to a sibling, an aunt, and a great uncle, right? Like whatever. But they just have to be 10 years apart, and they have to give advice to a graduating senior. So hopefully you enjoy this. Hopefully it's a good kind of capstone for this whole big picture life activity. If you think back to the very first video that we watched in this unit, it was the like Dear 5-year-old, or like Dear 7-year-old, stay weird. Then it was like Dear 22-year-old, and it kept getting older and older, and the advice kind of morphed and changed. That's what we're getting at here. Where is that human development coming from a psychological standpoint? So enjoy. If you have questions, you know where to find me.